Hello, everyone. Welcome back again to my YouTube video channel. Today, I want to share with you the interview of the two scientists, Dr. Robert Stadler and Dr. James Torr. Dr. James Torr, the chemist, the nanotechnologist, he held multiple degree in science, biology, chemistry, and science. And Dr. Robert Steller is the biomechanical engineer, the author of Scientist Approach of Evolution. Want you guys to have a chance to check out his their podcast today. So here we go.
This is where the whole thing blows open. I mean, the whole thing where people have said we are 99%, 98.5% the same as a chimpanzee. That's only when you're looking at less than 2% of the DNA that's in our bodies. So people need to realize this. Science changes, and then this being translated to the general public becomes much, much less. People don't want to talk about this with the general public because then we become wise to this, that, hey, the things that you taught us, the things that you said really don't have as much substance anymore. And what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with high confidence material because we can actually record the DNA. This isn't a bunch of speculation. We can see the regulation. Am I right on this, Rob? Well, hello. I'm here today with my friend Rob Stadler. I've interviewed him before on my podcast, but what we're going to do today is we're going to go through his new book called The Scientific Approach to Evolution. And if you are a Christian and you don't even like the discussions of evolution, hear us out. Hear this out. Hear Rob out and see what he has to say. And if you totally embrace evolution and you think it's silly to consider anything else, okay, well, hear us out and then make a judgment afterward. Let me just read a little bit about the background of Rob so that you get a sense of this. Rob Stadler earned his PhD in medical engineering from Harvard-MIT Division of Health Sciences and Technology. As a scientist in the medical device industry for almost 30 years, he obtained more than 175 U.S. patents, has more than 30 peer-reviewed publications, and has contributed to medical devices that are implanted in millions of patients worldwide. His experiences in gathering clinical evidence and in working in the Food and Drug Administration on the approval of medical devices, it prompted him to write this book, The Scientific Approach to Evolution: What They Didn't Teach You in Biology. And that's the topic of today's conversation. But I will mention he's also written another book, co-authored it, called The Stairway of Life, An Origin of Life Reality Check. So with that, welcome, Rob.
Hi, Jim. It's great to be here. Thank you.
You are a scientist. You're a medical device specialist. Do you believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Absolutely.
All right. And you think there's sufficient evidence for that?
Yes, I do, actually. Not scientific evidence I've uncovered myself, but it's out there.
I believe so too. I believe there's enormous historical evidence that points to the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if anybody watching doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, send me an email to tour@drjamestour.org, and we can get together and I'll share that with you. So that's an invitation to unbelievers, only unbelievers, not believers, because I wouldn't have time. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and Rob's going to give a presentation. This is sort of summarizing what his book talks about, so you can get a more detailed version from his book. And Rob, I'm going to try to not interrupt you much. It's hard for me. And I'll only try to interrupt you if I think you're wrong on something, I'll call you out. But if I think it needs more clarity, I'll speak up. Or if I think that people that you're talking about have gotten away with much too much and you're being too kind to them, and I sometimes can't contain myself. But I'll try to minimize my interruptions.
You're welcome to jump in anytime. It is your channel after all, and I'm very grateful that you would have me on here, so thank you. Yeah, so you see the book here and the topic about is evolution good science? And I want to start by broadening out a little bit here to recognize that we are right now in the midst of the information age. And every day here in the information age, you receive a deluge of new information coming at you from all kinds of sources. And surviving in this information age and not drowning in the information involves having a filter. And whether we recognize it or not, each of us has developed and honed and tuned our own filters, which is about accepting the information that you find to be truthful, that you trust, and then rejecting information that you don't trust. So each of us has these filters, and we're building on them and tuning them, and that's how we survive. But the question is, do you have the right filter for you? Because that filter really is defining who you are, what you believe, and how you perceive things. So that's kind of the big picture topic today, is about tuning this filter, particularly in the area of scientific evidence. In the world of scientific evidence, how do you know when you hear something tomorrow morning on the news, can I trust what they're saying, or is that kind of shaky, low confidence kind of science? And that's the big picture. But today we're gonna tune that in a little bit, focus on the topic of evolution and about evidence for evolution. Can you trust it or can you not trust it? And when I mention the term evolution, I'm talking about the big scale evolution here, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, where all of life today came from a common ancestor billions of years ago, a single cell, microscopic first life form that evolved into all life today. And that is quite in contrast with a simple reading of the book of Genesis, where God describes, instead of a single tree of life, he describes more of what I'd call a forest of life, where there are many different trees, and each tree is a kind of life. In Genesis chapter 1, the word kind comes up about 10 times. Like it does here in verse 24, God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. And so I think we're pretty familiar with things like the dog kind or canine, wherein wolves over time have diversified to produce all the breeds of dogs that we know and love today. But they're all still dogs. They're all still part of the dog kind, and they're on this tree, this single tree of dogs. And so the scientific question then is, which of these two hypotheses, the tree of life or the forest of life, is supported by science? Which one has the most evidence for it? And to just dip my toe in that a little bit, to just get started, I'd like to suggest that science, because of my practicing science for 30 years, science is so much about observing what you observe and how your observations teach you about natural laws, about how natural laws behave and what they do and what they don't do. And so that observation process requires a human there to be able to make those observations and to pass the learnings along to the next generation. But of course, over here on this tree of life, humans only existed for a pretty short period of time here in history. And beyond that, going back in the past, there really are no direct observations that anybody could have passed along. And that's not to say that science has no place back here, that science can't say anything. But what science has to say back here in the past is more tenuous. It is lower confidence kind of conclusions you'll come to compared to what you have here in the more recent time. And it's interesting when you compare the tree of life here under that view to the forest of life, you end up with almost the same exact picture. In other words, what humans have observed in our history and passed along is pretty much in agreement with what the Bible describes in Genesis.
If you do not believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, send me an email, tour@drjamestour.org, and we will get together, and I will share with you about why I embrace the resurrection of Jesus.
So we're going to go in a lot deeper into this, into what kind of evidence we have for evolution and what kind of evidence provides more confidence. But I just wanted to give that as a little foretaste of it. So according to science, we're trying to answer the question, which one of these two has more evidence? Which one can I trust in? And so being a good scientist, what you want to do is take these two hypotheses, gather evidence, and pile up the evidence and weigh it out and just determine which of the two hypotheses has more support. And then you need to keep an open mind and follow the evidence where it leads. And someday the evidence may change over. Some new evidence shows up. Well, you have to keep an open mind to that. And so that's what I'd like to do here. And to start off, I think everyone listening will know and agree pretty well that most scientists today say that the evidence in favor of evolution, the tree of life, is overwhelming. And scientists in biology books and all kinds of media will tell you that. And basically they'll say only a fool would disagree with that conclusion. And this is my son's high school AP biology textbook, and it's very clearly written in piling up evidence on the side of evolution. But there's two challenges to that. The first challenge is that these sources of information, they will only speak about evidence in favor of evolution, and they basically forbid or block out any discussion about the alternate hypothesis up front. And that actually is a very strong form of bias. It's kind of the worst kind of science, is when you block out the alternate hypothesis up front and you don't even allow it to be considered. So that concerns me right up front. But the second concern is that and this is what we're going to dig into with the book I wrote, is that they're actually, in the end, they're prioritizing weak or low confidence kinds of evidence over stronger forms of evidence or high confidence kinds of evidence in order to make this conclusion. And I find that very concerning. And I'm going to first dig into what do I mean by weak evidence or strong evidence. And I'm going to use my own area of study, medicine. In medical research, I think I can argue medicine is like the most valuable application of science to our society, because medicine determines life or death. When you take a pill or you go through some medical procedure, your life is on the line. And so you expect that good science is behind, what you're undergoing, or else you shouldn't trust it. You shouldn't trust your life to it. So in response to society really demanding good science behind medicine, now I'm not saying it's perfect, of course. There are mistakes made in medicine, but I'm saying society demands really good quality science behind medicine. That led all doctors in all countries to agree upon a categorization of evidence, levels of evidence. And that's shown here. So all doctors will agree on these levels of evidence, that if evidence in favor of a drug or in favor of some procedure is up here in level A, then that's considered quite strong evidence that justifies going ahead and prescribing that drug or something like that. And so forth down the line. We don't have to go into the details, but it's interesting to note that the lowest level of evidence here is called a consensus of expert opinion based on experience, based on their clinical experience. So expert opinion is actually considered not very strong here. What you really need is a randomized controlled trial in the field of medicine to convince people that this therapy is beneficial. Now, I wish that all forms of science had this kind of levels of evidence that are agreed upon, because I find in some areas of science that evidence is somehow all considered the same. Evidence is evidence, and there's not a clear way to stratify it like you see here. And so in the book I wrote here, I proposed 6 criteria to determine the level of evidence, and this is for all science, not just medicine, any field of science. And these 6 criteria, I've never actually had anyone debate them with me. People generally agree that these criteria, maybe there's plus or minus 1, 7 criteria, 5 criteria, but they all seem to agree that these criteria do determine the level of confidence you can have in scientific evidence. And this is helping you to determine your filter. Remember the filter of information that we all have. Now, these criteria are not exactly like black and white, right? It's actually kind of a spectrum of confidence you can place in a scientific result. It could be high, medium, low, so forth. But I'm going to go through these 6 criteria and give you a feel for what I'm talking about. Hopefully these are kind of obvious to you. Number 1 on the list of 6 is repeatable, right? If you have an experimental result or any kind of result and you can repeat it again and again, naturally you're building confidence that this is high confident result. And if someone else can repeat the experiment, get the exact same answer, that certainly gives you more confidence. And if somebody in another country can do it, even more confidence. So that one's pretty obvious. Number 2 on the list is that things that are directly measurable give you more confidence than things you can only assess very indirectly. Let me give you an example there. When I was a kid and I told my mom I wasn't feeling so good, she would come to measure my temperature, and she tended to do this indirect measurement of measuring my temperature. And she'd say, I think you have a fever or not. Of course, that doesn't give you as much confidence as the direct measurement. I think we can all agree on that one. Direct measurements give you more confidence. Another example of this would be if your goal is to study black holes out in outer space. Black holes, of course, you can't actually make direct measurements on them, and you can't like bring it into your laboratory and poke it and prod it and study it that way. And so what we know about black holes is all through indirect kind of results, and that makes it a lower confidence kind of finding. So that's number 2. Number 3 on the list of 6 is to conduct your studies prospectively. And what that means is that you plan the study in advance, and then you conduct the study, and you find out what it says that way. This is in contrast to looking back in time, looking back at data that you've already collected previously. That's a retrospective study. And the benefit of doing it prospectively is that you can design your experiment to control for things that might confound your results. So let's say I'm doing an experiment where I want to just simply study how fast an object falls. When I drop something, how fast does it fall? I can prospectively design that and prepare the study to block out any kind of confounding factor. Like, for example, the air in the room. The air in the room has an impact on how fast the object falls, especially if it's very windy, something like that. So I can plan the study to get the air out of the room and have a more controlled situation that gives me a more confident result. Number 4 in the list is to avoid bias. And bias is just devastating for science. I think any scientist would agree with me on that one. And we all have bias. I have bias. Everybody has bias. And we want to avoid bias in order to get to the truth. Bias is kind of like glasses that you're looking through because you perceive everything through your bias. And that can taint the results and cloud the truth. Now, when I do a clinical study for my work, I actually have to have a section of the protocol that I write that describes how I'm going to actively avoid bias or try to exclude bias from the study. So it's not good enough to just say, I'm going to try to not be biased. You got to actually take steps to try to avoid bias. And in clinical studies, we've probably heard of the concept of double-blind study, right, where the doctor doesn't know what drug you're getting and the patient doesn't know what they're getting, and that gets rid of quite a bit of bias in that sense. Number 5 is to avoid assumptions. Assumptions are kind of like shortcuts, and when you're doing science is hard to do, and naturally you look for ways to save money or save time, which almost always means taking an assumption, and that can be costly. They can really come back and ruin the whole result. So back to the experiment where I'm just going to drop an object and see how fast it falls. I mentioned that the air in the room is a confounding factor, right? That's going to mess with my experiment. But I'll tell you that in order to pull the air out of the room is going to cost me 6 months of time to build the equipment. It's going to cost $1 million. And so I'm really eager to try to make the assumption that the air just doesn't matter or it's insignificant. So these kind of things happen all the time in research. But the important thing is that you openly disclose the assumptions you make, and you provide a decent justification if you're going to make that assumption. And then people can decide if that was a reasonable, justified assumption or not. But the worst thing you can do is hide your assumptions and pretend like they don't exist. And then you're going to get in real trouble. And then the last one, number 6, and this is more about how you summarize your results. And it's about making reasonable claims. You don't want to make claims that are above and beyond the conditions in which you did the work. And I like to use this analogy here of a can of nuts. You could buy these nuts right now today, but the people who make these nuts, they really want you to buy lots of nuts. And so they want to make some claims here to get you interested in that. And one of the claims they make is that these are heart healthy and that the American Heart Association certifies them, making you think that eating them is going to make you live longer, so forth. But we have the Food and Drug Administration here, the FDA, and they make sure that claims are validated or are supported. And I think they required this little statement to be put on the can of nuts. Here it is. It says, scientific evidence suggests, but does not prove, that eating nuts may reduce the risk of heart disease. And I really appreciate this. It's a little awkward, I know, but I appreciate it because you see these hedging terms here. I think they're really honestly giving you a candid feel for how much evidence they have and what that evidence really has to say. They're not making some strong claim like if you eat these nuts, you'll live forever, or this will save 10 years from your life or something like that. This is reasonable. And that's number 6. In contrast to that, this would be my son's high school AP biology textbook, and it makes this statement. For example, organisms as dissimilar as humans and bacteria share genes inherited from a very distant common ancestor. So you note that this statement has no hedging terms. It doesn't say we think or evidence suggests or we believe or it may be. This is very directly exuding confidence, a certainty, you would say. But we'll get into it later about what's actually behind this statement. But I don't think the level of confidence that it's conveying is appropriate for the evidence that they have, as opposed to this statement made about the nuts. So we kind of have to ask, why is our society more concerned with claims made about nuts than about claims made about evolution? The textbooks can go forth and kind of ignore this make reasonable claims criteria when they write their textbook and teach our children. I find that concerning. So we've gone through these 6 criteria that tell you if you have high confidence or low confidence in something. And I hope that this is useful to everybody as a kind of filter, like I mentioned, when you get new information coming at you tomorrow, some of that deluge of tomorrow's information, that you'll be able to filter out things that you can have confidence in versus things that you can't. I could summarize it with going back to that example of, we talked about how fast does an object fall? It's a very simple question to ask of science. But I'm saying that if you conduct your experiments with meeting all 6 of these criteria, and it can be done to meet all 6 of these criteria, you're going to end up with answers that are very high confidence. You can put total trust in what you've got there, and people will use it, and it could be very helpful. In contrast to that, I'm going to put up the statement that I just read there. This is from my son's biology textbook. And it's addressing a different question. It's addressing the question over here. Do humans and bacteria share genes from a common ancestor, right? This goes back to that tree of life. And this statement in my kid's biology textbook is very strongly asserting, yes, they do share genes from a common ancestor. But if we ask science this question, can we answer this question while meeting these 6 criteria? Can it be done repeatably? In other words, can we repeatedly go into the lab with an organism and watch it evolve into bacteria and into humans, and definitely seeing that we have repeatedly made humans and bacteria from it. And of course, that can't be done. It's just simply not possible. Can it be directly observed? I kind of mentioned already, you can't observe this happening. Certainly nobody ever witnessed this happening. Can it be studied prospectively? Well, it's kind of the same answer. You can't go into the lab and do that. In fact, it's an extraordinarily retrospective study, if anything. Can you avoid bias when you try to answer this question? I think this question is just ripe, full of bias. People come at this with a very strong answer already before they even consider the science. There's plenty of opportunity for bias here. And in fact, I think the bias can swamp what the evidence actually has to say, because the evidence is pretty quiet here. And number 5, are we careful to avoid assumptions? I think this entire statement up here from my son's biology textbook is based on an assumption. Basically, they're assuming that if I have a gene and bacteria has the same gene, then the only explanation for that is that there was a common ancestor. That's how we end up with the same gene. That isn't proven, again, because we haven't been able to observe it or test it, but it's an assumption. And so I think the entire statement is based upon an assumption that they're not stating up front. And number 6, overstated claims. We already kind of talked about that. This has no kind of hedging language, anything in it. It's exuding confidence that actually doesn't exist. So this statement belongs way over here on the left in the very low confidence bin because it fails all 6 of these criteria. In contrast to something like this, which you can just really nail it with science to get the right answer. So I hope this kind of thing is helpful, going forward from today when you hear things on the news tomorrow about some new scientific finding, like something found on Mars or some new drug for cancer. You put this into practice. So getting back to our question of focus here, which is we have these 2 hypotheses, and according to science, which one of these 2 has stronger support? And we're going to gather the evidence and weigh it out and see what we got here. So what evidence do we have in support of this tree of life? What's the best evidence we have to support this? And if you look at biology textbook or you look at any kind of media on this topic, books by Richard Dawkins or anyone else in this area, generally they'll categorize the evidence into these 4 categories. I think we're all familiar with the fossil record. They claim that is in support of this tree of life. Geographic distribution, it's a topic like why don't we have penguins here in Minnesota? Why are animals distributed around the world the way they are? Vestigial organs like your appendix, probably familiar with that, is seen to be evidence in favor of this tree of life. And then comparing different life forms, that also involves the statement I just made, but it's about saying like, my arm has 1 long bone in the humerus, and then it has 2 long bones below the elbow, and then 5 fingers. Well, it turns out that reptiles and dogs and bats all have that same arrangement in their appendage. And so because they have the same arrangement, that suggests that we came from a similar common ancestry. And just to summarize this a little more clearly, I'm gonna phone a friend here and bring up a short video from Richard Dawkins, where he is asked this same question: what's the best evidence we have for evolution?
Out of all the evidence used to support the theory of evolution, what would you say is the strongest, most irrefutable single piece of evidence in support of the theory?
There's an enormous amount of evidence from all sorts of places, and it's hard to pick one strand which is more important than any other. There's fossils, there's the evidence from geographical distribution, there's the evidence from vestigial organs. I think, to me, perhaps the most compelling evidence is comparative evidence from modern animals, particularly biochemical comparative evidence, genetic, molecular evidence.
Because of you, millions of people have heard the gospel. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that he's risen from the dead, and you will be saved.
That's right.
That's the requirement. We talk about science concepts which draw people in. Take these nanomachines and have them drill into cells. This would be a great way to kill cancer, right? We also talk about Jesus Christ, who's the best in everything. My faith in Jesus Christ means more to me than anything. If you could continue to give or give for the first time, we would certainly appreciate it. You can go to jesusandscience.org. Thank you so much.
Okay, so you heard it directly from him. This is the evidence he has. And what is the best form of evidence he's got? And that would be a comparison of life forms, comparison of the genetic similarity between life forms is the best evidence he's got. The problem is that the statement that we just analyzed rather carefully here, this statement is about comparing life forms, finding similar genes between humans and bacteria. And we just went through that and determined that it meets none of these 6 criteria for high confidence. In fact, it's the lowest of low confidence. And yet, Richard Dawkins says, that is the best, the most compelling evidence that I got. It doesn't get any better than that. And that's from his own words. And so I didn't go through all the details about the fossil record and geographic distribution and all that, but it's in the book. But all of those forms of evidence, when you compare it against these 6 criteria, they fail. Every one of these criteria, all of this stuff is very low confidence evidence. And it surprises me that our children aren't given consideration of that in schools. And they're basically just fed this as the only evidence that there is, and it's overwhelmingly supporting this tree of life. So we're left to ask, is there any high confidence evidence for evolution? Is there anything out there that's better than this? And maybe it'll surprise you that there is high confidence evidence that deals with evolution. And this is one example. Richard Lenski, a professor at Michigan there, he spent his whole career studying E. coli, the bacteria, growing them in his laboratory. And he's actually gone through 80,000 generations now. He just surpassed that, studying how they change over time with 80,000 generations. He does about 6 or 7 generations per day. Fortunately, E. coli, replicate faster than humans, quite a bit. Now, quite interestingly, after 33,000 generations, so this is about 10 trillion organisms he had produced in his lab, the E. coli there developed the ability to eat something, to get energy out of a food source that they hadn't used before. It's a molecule called citrate. And that was in the media that he bathed the bacteria in each day. And so these E. coli that developed this ability, they suddenly, replicated much more readily and took over the population. And this was considered to be a big evolutionary feat. In fact, in The Greatest Show on Earth, a book by Richard Dawkins, he spent like a whole chapter talking about how great this experiment was. And he called this finding a beautiful demonstration of evolution in action, with new information entering genomes and combinations of new genes. So there was a lot of media hype about this. Unfortunately, Richard Dawkins made this statement and wrote this book, published it, before the actual genetic information came out about what had changed after 33,000 generations. So Richard Lenski's lab, he had these 2 papers come out, and these 2 papers showed exactly what genetic changes had happened. And it turned out that the ability to metabolize citrate involved duplicating one existing gene, simply took a gene and made another copy of it, put it down somewhere else in the DNA. And then another gene, the bacteria lost control of it. It lost its ability to regulate that gene. So that's actually a loss of information. And those 2 mutations led to this evolution, if you will. And so I think Richard Dawkins was quite misled in his conclusions, which came out before the real data came out. But this study it gives us quite a feeling for what evolution can accomplish, what it's capable of accomplishing in quite a large number of generations. And I need to highlight that all of that was high confidence kind of work. It's repeatable, it's directly measurable because you can sequence the DNA in the genes. He actually froze samples of the bacteria, and you can bring them back to life and repeat the experiment. And it's prospectively studied, all those things.
So wait a minute. Let me. He when he froze them, it wasn't like he brought them back to life. They were never dead.
That's
He
right.
brought them back to life, right? So
That's right. I'll go back.
it just goes into a dormant state.
Yes.
Correct. I just want to be sure because
Yeah,
I didn't think
exactly
anyone
right.
ever's brought something back to life. Okay.
Yeah, so like this happened, he would save off and freeze like every 500 generations. He would freeze a sample of these bacteria. And so when this happened, he actually went back to frozen previous generations and was able to get them, to go through this kind of transition as well. So he could repeat the experiment, is what I'm saying, by having frozen it
Right.
in time.
And once you have bacteria that have this genetic change, bacteria are amazing because they share DNA with each other. And that's how you can get the ones that were frozen. It doesn't take them as long to acquire this. They got it very quickly from their neighbors. Is that correct?
Yeah, they share genes. Yeah, it's kind of like sharing information with your friend on how to do your taxes or whatever it is. That's what
Yeah.
bacteria can do.
Yeah.
And just add a little more color to this. It turns out that E. coli have always had the ability to metabolize citrate, but they only metabolize it when there's no oxygen around. So if he simply put these bacteria in an environment without oxygen, they would have started eating the citrate. But these bacteria here, these E. coli in his lab, developed the ability to metabolize citrate in the presence of oxygen, which, as I say down here, is actually a result of losing control over a gene that was there to trigger when oxygen was not available. So that's kind of interesting. So another experiment, this is...
Hi guys, so those of you who are watching this interview by Dr. James Torres and Dr. Uh, James Tor and the Dr. Stadler, I just want to stop right now. I will continue share the interview next, but I want you to have a chance to learn more about the discussion very deep in terms of the evidence of evolution and how is that related to the biblical terminology. So check it out on Dr. James Tor channel. I want to end it right now and I want to streamline again tonight. Have a great day.